Glittering stones once shaped how humanity understood the universe. This is the story of the ancient mineral trade, a force that sparked the very first conversations between myth and science. By the end, you will see the deep connections between the rocks beneath our feet and the ideas inside our minds. Why did cultures separated by continents tell similar stories about the same stones? How did a merchant weighing Lapis Lazuli help invent rational thought? The foundations of our world were built not in temples, but in the hands of traders. What does it mean that our search for meaning began with a search for stone? Obsidian's journey began not in a king's treasury, but in the hands of a hunter. This volcanic glass, sharper than any other stone, could slice through flesh and hide with astonishing ease. Its value was immediate and tangible. From its sources in places like Anatolia, the stone traveled astonishing distances, hundreds of miles across the Near East, passed from one settlement to the next. This was not a trade of luxuries but of necessity. The routes it carved across the landscape became the world's first information highways. A trader from a distant village would arrive, his pack full of the glossy black stone. He would negotiate using gestures and perhaps a few shared words, establishing a value and a measure for his goods. In that simple act of barter, something profound was happening. The need for a consistent weight, for a shared understanding of value, forced people to develop the first systems of measurement. This was the birth of practical, systematic thought, a logic born directly from the earth. And with the trader came more than just his wares. He carried the stories of his homeland, tales of the fiery mountains that gave birth to the black glass, or the spirits that were said to dwell within it. The physical network of trade routes became a conduit for a far more precious cargo, ideas. For the first time, a community's local myths about the world were set beside the practical knowledge of a stranger. This was the quiet, unceremonious beginning of a conversation that would reshape human consciousness forever. Its dual nature made obsidian a cornerstone of early civilization. Here was a material that could be used to skin a deer with incredible precision, yet was also believed to hold the essence of a deity. This was not a contradiction to the ancient mind, but a unity. The same sharp edge that ensured survival in a harsh world was also thought to be capable of cutting through malevolent spirits. This is where myth and science began their long dance. A trader navigating by the stars to transport the stone was engaging in a form of proto-science. He was observing celestial patterns, memorizing landmarks, and creating mental maps of the world. These were empirical acts born of necessity, yet the stars he used for guidance were also seen as gods or the homes of ancestors. The very act of practical navigation was steeped in a celestial mythology. The object he carried, the obsidian itself, embodied this same fusion. Its practical utility was undeniable, a fact proven every time it cleanly butchered meat. But its origin from the heart of a volcano, a place of terrifying power and beauty, demanded a story. So myths emerged of mountains that wept black tears or of the night sky itself shattering and falling to earth. These stories were not lies. They were the first attempts to explain a complex world, to give meaning to a substance that was both profoundly useful and mysteriously beautiful. In holding a piece of obsidian, an early human was not just holding a tool, they were holding a question. How could something so practical also feel so sacred? The struggle to answer that question, to bridge the gap between the hand that uses and the mind that wanders, set the stage for everything that followed. While obsidian was born from earthly fire, another stone fell from the sky, or so it seemed. Lapis lazuli possessed a blue so deep and vibrant it was unlike anything else in the ancient world. This was not the blue of a shallow river or a simple flower. It was the blue of a midnight sky, a celestial vault captured in stone. Its sole source was a single, harsh mountain range in what is now Afghanistan, a place unimaginably distant from the centers of emerging civilization. Yet, against all logic, this stone found its way into the heart of Egyptian tombs and Mesopotamian temples, a glittering blue offering placed beside kings and deities. Its very presence there was a miracle of human connection. The journey of a single piece of lapis, traveling over thousands of miles through countless hands, was a feat as monumental as the pyramids themselves. This was not merely a trade route, it was a bridge between worlds. For the priests and shamans who held it, this stone was a piece of the heavens, a physical fragment of the divine realm. They believed it could open channels of communication with the gods, that its color held the very essence of cosmic truth. It was more than a symbol. It was a conduit. This spiritual power was made visible when artisans discovered they could crush the stone into a brilliant powder, creating the first ultramarine pigment. To paint with this blue was to literally smear the sacred onto a temple wall or a statue, making the divine visible to all. But this profound spiritual value rested upon a foundation of sheer, gritty practicality. Transporting such a precious material across deserts and mountains required more than just brave merchants. It demanded innovation. How do you organize a caravan that must travel for months? How do you feed the people and animals involved? How do you navigate trackless wastes and negotiate safe passage with countless foreign tribes? The answers to these questions drove early advances in logistics, in engineering, and critically, in mathematics. The need to account for goods, to calculate distances and rations, to establish fair exchanges across different cultures, all of this forced the development of more sophisticated number systems and record-keeping. The same mind that revered the lapis as a sacred object was also the mind that had to solve the complex equation of its delivery, so the stone existed at this perfect crossroads. It was both a key to the heavens and a driver of earthly knowledge. In its deep blue heart, the abstract concept of divinity and the concrete reality of a merchant's ledger began to merge, each giving shape and purpose to the other. The golden glow of amber felt like captured sunlight, a warmth you could hold in your hand. This fossilized tree resin, traveling from the cold Baltic coast to the sun-drenched Mediterranean, held a mystery within its honey-colored depths. For the ancient Greeks, its origin was a story of cosmic tragedy. They told of the Heliades, sisters who so endlessly mourned their brother Phaethon after his fatal attempt to drive the sun chariot that the gods transformed them into poplar trees. Their tears, shed for all eternity, were said to be this golden amber, solidifying their divine grief into a beautiful, tangible substance. This was a myth that gave profound emotional meaning to the material's very existence. Yet, in the hands of a natural philosopher like Thales of Miletus, the very same stone revealed a different kind of secret. He discovered that when rubbed with a cloth, the amber could attract lightweight objects like feathers or bits of straw. It was as if the stone had come to life, reaching out with an invisible force. This was not a story about gods, but a direct observation of a physical phenomenon, the first recorded investigation into what we now call static electricity. Here, in a single piece of traded material, the ancient world found its perfect crossroads. The same golden lump that inspired a poet to sing of celestial sorrow also prompted a thinker to question the fundamental forces of nature. It was a material that could simultaneously answer the heart's need for a story and the mind's hunger for a puzzle. The tears of grieving sisters and the spark of a new scientific inquiry were not in conflict. They were two different languages, both speaking truths about the same mysterious, glowing stone. The transformation of copper ore was a kind of alchemy that reshaped reality itself. A dull, greenish rock was placed into a fire, subjected to blistering heat, and from the ashes emerged a glowing, liquid metal that cooled into a substance both beautiful and useful. This was not merely a technical process, it was a visible miracle. For the metalworkers in places like the Balkans and Anatolia around 5,000 years before the Common Era, this act of smelting required a deep, intuitive understanding of temperature and chemistry. They learned to build specific furnace designs, to mix the ore with charcoal, and to control the airflow to achieve a heat so intense it could break the very bonds of stone. This was applied science in its purest form, a giant leap in human capability born from careful observation and repeated experiment. Yet, the human mind could not simply accept this wonder as a mere recipe. The process demanded a story. The transformation was so profound it mirrored the greatest mysteries of life and death. The ore was buried in the earth, a kind of death. The fire was a trial, a purgatory, and the flowing, bright copper that emerged was a glorious rebirth. This symbolic cycle resonated deeply, and so myths grew around the forge. In Egypt, the god Ptah was the ultimate embodiment of this fusion. He was the divine craftsman, the patron of artisans and metalworkers, the one who knew the secrets of transforming raw materials. But he was also the supreme creator god, said to have conceived the world in his heart and then spoken it into existence. The same skill that allowed a human to shape metal was seen as a reflection of the divine power that shaped the cosmos. The line between technical skill and cosmic power was utterly blurred. This created a powerful template for human understanding. Every time a worker smelted copper, they were not just making a tool, they were participating in a sacred drama of death and rebirth. The empirical knowledge of how to achieve the transformation existed side by side with the mythic framework for why it was significant. One explained the mechanics, the other gave it meaning. In the flickering light of the forge, the first alchemists discovered that to change the material world was also to change the world of ideas. The world's first global cities were built on stone and metal. In the crowded, dusty streets of Uruk, Byblos, and Mohenjo-Daro, you could hear a dozen languages spoken in a single market. These were not just centers of commerce, but epicenters of thought, where caravans from the mountains met ships from distant coasts, and every trader's pack was filled with more than just goods. Each sack of Lapis Lazuli, each ingot of copper, carried with it an entire cosmology. When a merchant from Mesopotamia unrolled a leather bundle to show his gleaming obsidian blades, he might speak of the god Enlil, whose mighty footsteps were said to shake the very earth. At the next stall, a trader from the Indus Valley, offering the same black stone, might describe enormous serpents writhing in their subterranean realms, causing the ground to tremble. Both explanations made perfect sense within their own cultures, yet here they stood side by side, two different answers to the same fundamental question. For the first time, people were confronted with the undeniable fact that the world could be explained in more than one way. This collision of myths did not create instant skepticism, but it did plant a seed. If two cultures could have different stories for an earthquake, then perhaps the ultimate truth was more complex than any single tale. Alongside this intellectual friction came a practical demand for harmony. How could you fairly trade a weight of Baltic amber for a measure of Afghan lapis without a shared system of value? The chaos of the marketplace necessitated order. Standardized weights, often carved in stone to resemble animals or gods, became the first universal language. the invention of consistent measurement was a profound leap. It meant that trust was no longer based solely on a handshake or a person's reputation, but could be embedded in an object, a number, a shared standard that transcended culture and belief. This was the birthplace of objective fact. A shekel of silver was a shekel of silver, whether you prayed to Enlil or to an Indus serpent god. In this bustling, noisy environment, the abstract world of myth and the concrete world of commerce began a constant, silent dialogue. The need for practical agreement on weight and measure created a foundation of shared reality, while the exposure to competing myths stretched the imagination, suggesting that reality itself might be wider and more mysterious than anyone had supposed. These mythic classifications were far more than just charming stories. They functioned as the world's first filing system for natural knowledge. Before the periodic table or Mohs scale of hardness, ancient cultures sorted the mineral kingdom by its perceived divine connections. Hematite, with its rust-red streak, was not just an iron ore. It was the crystallized blood of gods or fallen warriors, a classification that instantly communicated its vital, potent nature. Emeralds were not merely beryl-colored by chromium. They were the eternal tears of a goddess, forever green with sorrow, which explained their origin and their perceived power to soothe the eyes and reveal truth. A lump of meteoritic iron falling from the sky was unambiguously classified as a gift from the heavens, a metal forged in the celestial realm and therefore imbued with unearthly strength. This symbolic system was incredibly efficient. It bundled together a mineral's physical appearance, its suspected origin, and its practical or spiritual use into a single, memorable package. A single mythic label could tell you everything you needed to know. If this stone is the blood of a god, then it must be powerful, likely connected to life force and warfare, and should be handled with reverence. This was a cognitive map that allowed a vast and confusing natural world to be navigated with confidence. The framework was symbolic, not scientific, but its purpose was deeply rational, to create order from chaos. These patterns of thought, of grouping like with like and seeking underlying connections, established the very mental habits that would one day lead to mineralogy. The human mind was practicing the art of classification, using the language of myth as its first and most powerful tool. The marketplace demanded a different kind of sight. A trader assessing a block of Lapis Lazuli was not looking for the tears of a goddess, but for a deep, uniform blue uninterrupted by veins of white calcite. An artisan selecting obsidian judged it by the perfection of its conchoidal fracture, the way it broke into razor-sharp, curved flakes, and by a desirable translucency that hinted at its purity. With turquoise, the critical measure was a consistent, vibrant color, free from the dullness that suggested inferior quality. These were practical, visual tests, repeated countless times every day at stalls and in workshops. This was a knowledge built not from sacred texts, but from the accumulated experience of the hand and the eye. Generation after generation, artisans and merchants honed this skill of empirical assessment, building a vast, unspoken library of material properties. They knew which quarry produced the most resonant jade for carving, which source of flint would nap predictably, which seam of copper ore yielded the most malleable metal. This body of practical knowledge existed in parallel to the grand mythic stories, and sometimes the two frameworks would collide. What happened when a piece of lapis, revered as a sacred piece of the heavens, was found to be pale and fractured, and therefore of low commercial value? The myth said it was divine, but the merchant's scale and the artisan's eye declared it inferior. This created a quiet but profound tension. The symbolic meaning of the stone was absolute, but its material reality was now subject to a new kind of scrutiny, a scrutiny based on observable, repeatable qualities. The bustling marketplace, with its shouts and bartering, became an unwitting laboratory. Here, the authority of a well-told story began to be weighed against the authority of a careful observation. It was not a dramatic overthrow of belief, but the start of a long, slow dialogue. The world was beginning to be understood not only for what it symbolized, but for what it actually was. The night sky was not just a map for ancient traders, it was a living clockwork of divine influence. As merchants guided their caravans by the fixed patterns of stars, they began to see a deeper connection between the heavens above and the stones in their packs. They noticed that carnelian, with its warm, glowing red hue, seemed to capture the very essence of the rising sun. It became a stone of dawn, believed to hold the sun's vitality and power. Silver, cool and luminous, was naturally paired with the moon, its metallic sheen reflecting the celestial body that governed the tides and the rhythms of the night. Specific stars were thought to beam their energy down to Earth, charging certain minerals with unique potency at particular times of the year. This was more than simple poetry. The timing of trade itself was governed by these cycles. A trader knew that the best Lapis Lazuli arrived from the mountains after a certain constellation became visible in the autumn sky. He might also observe that the price of copper ingots seemed to fluctuate with the phases of Venus. These were perceived correlations, patterns that linked the cosmic order to the very practical matters of supply, demand, and value. This created a powerful feedback loop. The need to navigate and time journeys encouraged more precise observation of the stars. That astronomical data was then woven back into the mythological identity of the minerals, enriching their stories with celestial authority. The wealth generated from trading those same stones then funded the construction of observatories and the maintenance of scribes who could record celestial events with greater accuracy. The merchant seeking profit and the priest seeking cosmic truth were, in a very real sense, looking at the same sky. One was funding the science of observation, while the other was crafting the mythology that gave those observations meaning. In this way, the practical engine of mineral commerce indirectly powered the development of astronomy, forever entwining the cold light of distant stars with the warm glow of precious stones. Healing was a matter of earth and spirit. In the shadowy rooms of ancient apothecaries, minerals were ground into powders not just for paint, but for medicine. An Egyptian healer would carefully grind vibrant green malachite into a fine dust, mixing it with fat to create an ointment for the eyes. On Mesopotamian tablets, recipes prescribed iron oxides to treat wounds and reduce inflammation. These were not random acts of desperation, but the results of careful, repeated observation. A healer would note that a paste made from a specific green stone seemed to soothe infected cuts, or that a red powder helped stop bleeding. This was the slow, methodical accumulation of cause and effect, the very bedrock of the scientific method. Yet, this empirical knowledge was seamlessly wrapped in a mythic understanding of the world. The green malachite was sacred to Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of beauty, love, and sky. Its use in a healing salve was not just a chemical reaction, it was an appeal to her divine power. The act of healing was seen as a form of spiritual purification, a cleansing of the body that was blessed by the gods. A successful treatment did two things at once. It validated the practical, observed property of the mineral, proving it worked in the physical world, and in the minds of the healer and the patient, it also validated the mythological framework. The goddess had answered their prayers through the medium of the stone. This created a powerful, self-reinforcing loop. Because the malachite was linked to Hathor, it was considered potent and worthy of use. Its repeated use then provided more evidence of its efficacy, which in turn strengthened the belief in Hathor's connection to it. in the apothecary's mortar, where stone was crushed into medicine, the two ways of knowing reached a temporary truce. The myth gave the practice its meaning and cultural permission, while the practice gave the myth its tangible, repeatable proof. This pharmacological bridge was where the abstract concept of divine will met the undeniable reality of a healed wound, forcing a conversation that would slowly, over centuries, change them both. A crossroads like Dilmun was more than a trading post, it was a theater of the mind. Here, a merchant from Mesopotamia might unroll a cloth to reveal deep blue Lapis Lazuli, telling his customer that this stone was born from the cosmic corpse of the goddess Tiamat, slain by the god Marduk to create the world. At the very next stall, an Egyptian trader offering the same precious stone would explain it was a fragment of the starry vault of the goddess Nut, whose body arched over the earth. Both stones were identical in color and value, yet their stories of origin were worlds apart. This was the first great collision of worldviews, happening not in a library, but in the dust of the marketplace. Practical miners from different regions faced a similar puzzle. A man who dug for copper in Anatolia would share his technique for shoring up tunnels with timber, while a miner from the Indus Valley described a different method for separating ore from surrounding rock using water. Their practical knowledge was immediately translatable and could be tested on the spot, but their explanations for why the veins of metal were there in the first place could not be so easily reconciled. One might speak of a subterranean serpent depositing the ore, another of a earth god's bones becoming metal. When these practical and sacred narratives met, it created a profound cognitive dissonance. How could the same blue stone come from a slain goddess and a starry sky? How could the same copper be extracted with two different techniques, yet explained by two different gods? The easy path was to simply reject the foreign story as nonsense, but the hard and more fruitful path was to search for common ground. This pressure to find synthesis, to trade not just goods but ideas, often led to new, blended understandings. Perhaps a traveling scribe, hearing both the Mesopotamian and Egyptian tales of Lapis, began to think of the stone not as one thing or the other, but as a bridge between heaven and chaos. Maybe a metalworker adopted a new smelting technique from a foreigner, but incorporated it into his own local myth, seeing the improved process as a better way to honor his own god of the forge. In these moments at the bustling crossroads, the human mind was forced to do something revolutionary. It had to hold multiple truths at once, weighing the undeniable reality of the material against the beautiful diversity of its stories. The search for a common language to describe the world had begun, and it started with a bargain over a piece of blue stone. A scribe's stylus pressed into damp clay, etching the weight of Lapis Lazuli for a merchant's ledger on one line, and on the very next, inscribing the epic tale of how that same stone was born from the body of a slain goddess. This was not a contradiction in his work, but its very essence. These early scribes were the world's first true information architects, living in the narrow space where the sacred met the commercial. Their primary tool, the emerging system of writing, was itself a hybrid creation. Cuneiform, for instance, evolved from simple pictographs used to count sacks of grain and blocks of stone into a complex script capable of capturing the subtle emotions of a prayer or the precise dimensions of a temple. The same symbol that once denoted a sheep for tax purposes could, in a different context, represent a sacrificial offering to a deity. This dual purpose was baked into the very language they used. A single tablet could begin with a meticulous account of the quality of obsidian blades received from a northern trader, noting their translucency and the perfection of their edges, and then, without any visible break, transition into a hymn praising the volcanic god who forged those blades in his subterranean fires. The scribe was not compartmentalizing his mind. He was weaving two different kinds of truth into a single, durable record. His work demanded he be fluent in the language of the marketplace and the tongue of the temple. He had to know that a shekel was a shekel, a universal measure of weight, but he also had to understand that the deep blue of Lapis was a color of divine royalty, a fact as real to his culture as the weight itself. In this daily practice of documentation, these scribes became accidental philosophers. They were the first to systematically place a measurable, empirical fact right beside a profound, mythic narrative, forcing a silent comparison. The ledger entry for the Lapis gave it a concrete, tradable value. The myth inscribed beside it gave that value a cosmic meaning. One described its place in the human world of commerce, the other its place in the universal order of the gods. By recording both in permanent clay, the scribe created a new kind of reality, one where the spiritual significance of an object and its physical properties were understood as two sides of the same tablet. This bureaucratic habit of cross-referencing the practical and the sacred did more than just preserve information. It established a foundational pattern for human thought, creating a permanent archive where myth and measurement began their long, slow dance toward a unified understanding of the world. The furnace was more than a tool, it was a crucible for the human soul. Across the ancient world, from the royal workshops of Mesopotamia to the philosophical schools of China, the transformation of metal became a powerful metaphor for an inner journey. The process was always the same. A dull, worthless-looking rock and ore was placed into the searing heat. Through this trial by fire, the impurities were burned away, leaving behind a substance of pure, radiant value. This was not just metallurgy, it was a visible parable for spiritual purification. The quest for personal enlightenment was mirrored in the quest to create perfect gold from base matter. This symbolic resonance gave birth to alchemy, a discipline that stood exactly at the crossroads of our story. It was not yet science, and it was no longer pure myth. It was the space in between where the hands worked with matter while the mind sought the divine. The alchemist was both a chemist and a mystic. His laboratory was filled with practical knowledge. He knew that heating cinnabar would always release quicksilver, that certain acids could dissolve gold, and that specific minerals produced predictable colors when ground. These were empirical facts, observed and recorded with meticulous care. Yet, for the alchemist, these physical reactions were also sacred symbols. The volatility of quicksilver represented the elusive human spirit. The dissolution of gold was a death that preceded resurrection. The quest to turn lead into gold was not merely about wealth, but about achieving a state of spiritual perfection. Why did this fusion happen around metallurgy? Because the process itself was so reliable. A Chinese alchemist working with cinnabar and a Mesopotamian metalworker smelting copper, though separated by continents, would both witness the same unbreakable rules. The ore always yielded its metal under the same conditions. This regularity of material behavior presented a quiet but persistent challenge to purely mythological explanations. If a god's whim controlled the forge, why did the reaction succeed every single time the steps were followed correctly? The material world was demonstrating a consistency that demanded a new kind of understanding. Alchemy was the human response. It did not abandon the old stories, but it began to layer a new, operational truth on top of them. The alchemist's recipe was a precise set of instructions that had to be followed for the transformation to occur. This introduced a radical idea that the secrets of the cosmos were not locked away in cryptic poems alone, but were also embedded in the very behavior of matter, waiting to be unlocked through careful, repeatable experiment. In the alchemist's fire, the first sparks of a new worldview were kindled, a view where the journey to understand the universe would forever be tied to the act of transforming the humble materials beneath our feet. Color itself became a language spoken in the deep blue of Lapis and the shocking red of cinnabar. These were not just hues, they were ideas made visible, and their meanings traveled along the trade routes just as surely as the stones themselves. Lapis Lazuli's celestial blue was so unique it could not be ignored. In Egypt, this color was not merely decorative, it was the hair of the gods and the physical substance of the heavens. To wear lapis was to wrap yourself in the divine, yet every merchant who carried this stone knew a more earthly truth. Its singular, vibrant blue came from one specific, arid mountain range in a distant land. The myth said the color was a piece of the sky, but the map pointed to a very particular spot on the ground. This created a quiet tension. If the color was divine, why was its source so localized and mundane? The symbolic meaning was universal, but its physical origin was a geographical fact. This duality forced a new kind of observation. A sharp-eyed trader learned to distinguish the prized deep blue lapis from paler imitations, his eye trained to see the subtle variations that spoke of quality and origin. His assessment was not based on myth, but on the empirical evidence of color saturation and the presence of impurities. In his hands, the sacred blue became a subject of material analysis. The same dialogue unfolded with the brilliant red of cinnabar. Its color was the color of life, of blood, of power. Across continents, it was associated with vitality, used in rituals and burials to symbolize eternal life. But to unlock that symbolic power as a pigment, to make the color speak on a cave wall or a royal mask, required a deep, practical understanding of the material itself. Artisans had to learn that grinding cinnabar produced a fine powder that could be mixed with binders. They discovered, perhaps through tragic accident, that it was toxic to breathe its dust and that its color could darken over time when exposed to light. These were not symbolic lessons, they were chemical ones. The meaning of the color was one thing, a story about blood and life. The behavior of the mineral was another, a set of physical properties that had to be obeyed. One existed in the world of ideas, the other in the world of matter, and they were in constant conversation. The myth gave the color its profound significance, making it worthy of all the effort to mine and process the dangerous ore. And the practical struggle to work with the mineral, to understand its quirks and dangers, in turn enriched the myth, adding layers of respect and caution to its story. The color red was both a symbol of life force and a physical substance that could take life if handled improperly. In that space between the ideal and the real, our ancestors began to paint a more complete picture of their world, one where the poetry of color and the prose of geology were forever intertwined. A ship captain in the ancient Mediterranean held a strange, heavy stone in his palm. This was Lodestone, a magnetic iron ore that seemed to possess a life of its own. On a cloudy night with no stars to guide him, this stone became his North Star. He would place it on a piece of wood floating in a bowl of water and watch, mesmerized, as it slowly, stubbornly turned to align itself with an invisible line pointing north. This was not just a tool, it was a miracle. The Phoenician traders who relied on it knew its empirical value intimately. Their entire trade network, their very survival on the open sea, depended on the consistent, predictable behavior of this rock. They had to observe it with a scientist's eye, noting its pull on iron nails, its unwavering directional preference. This was hard-won practical knowledge. Yet the human mind could not accept such a wonder as mere mechanics. How could a stone know the way home? The answer had to be a story. So myths emerged of a great magnetic mountain at the edge of the world, a peak with such power it could pull the very nails from a ship's hull. Others spoke of a god's hand reaching up from the depths to guide the vessel's prow. The empirical utility of the lodestone and its mythological explanation were not in competition. They were two halves of a whole. The stone's reliable performance validated the myth, proving the god was indeed guiding them, and the grand cosmic story, in turn, gave profound meaning to the simple, observed fact of the stone's rotation in a water bowl. This fusion reached its zenith in ancient China, where the development of the first compasses was deeply entangled with concepts of cosmic harmony. The spoon-shaped lodestone spinning on a polished bronze plate did not just point south. It aligned with the fundamental order of the universe, interacting with the forces of yin and yang and the 5 elemental phases. The directions were not just points on a map. They were governed by spirits, each with its own color, season, and symbolic animal. To use the compass was to engage in a sacred act of balancing oneself with the cosmos. The practical need to not get lost on a long journey thus funded a profound philosophical and spiritual system. The mariner checking his compass was, perhaps without knowing it, participating in a grand dialogue. His hand on the tiller was responding to the same invisible force that philosophers said governed the stars and the seasons. In the quiet turn of a magnetic needle, the most urgent of human needs, the need to find our way, forced myth and measurement into a single, unbreakable bond. That heavy stone weight in a merchant's hand was more than a tool for trade. It was a silent revolution. Carved from dense hematite or polished diorite, these objects represented one of humanity's first great intellectual leaps, the agreement on a universal standard. For trade to function across languages and cultures, a shekel had to be a shekel, whether you were in Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley. This was the birth of an objective reality, a fact that existed outside of any single belief system. It did not matter if you believed the sun was a god riding a chariot or a fiery disk. The weight of a silver ingot was the same. This fundamental agreement created a bedrock of trust that allowed commerce and civilization itself to flourish on a grand scale. Yet the revolution was not a clean break from the past. Look closely at one of these ancient weights. You might find it shaped like a sleeping duck, an animal sacred to a local goddess of wisdom. Or its surface might be inscribed with the symbol of a storm god, a deity believed to oversee oaths and agreements. Here lies the beautiful contradiction. The object itself, the very instrument of objective measurement, was draped in the language of myth and symbol. The culture was using its oldest framework, that of sacred stories, to legitimize and sanctify its newest and most powerful tool, that of universal measure. The weight stone thus became a perfect philosophical object. In one hand, it was an absolute arbiter of material value, demanding a form of thinking we would call rational and empirical. In the other hand, it was a sacred totem connecting the act of commerce to the divine order. This was not a confused mind, but a mind trying to hold two different kinds of truth together. The merchant using this weight was living in both worlds at once. He was applying a consistent mathematical standard to his transactions, while simultaneously appealing to a higher power to witness and bless the fairness of the exchange. The stone itself did not see a conflict. Its weight was a fixed physical property, a fact of nature. Its shape was a story, a fact of culture. In that one small, heavy object, the dialogue between the world as it is measured and the world as it is imagined found its most durable and practical expression. A perfectly shaped quartz crystal could capture the world and turn it upside down. The earliest gem cutters, working with simple bow drills and abrasive sands, unlocked a secret hidden within the stone itself. By grinding a crystal into a precise convex form, they found it would magnify whatever lay beneath it, making tiny scratches on a seal or the fine weave of a textile suddenly leap into clear view. This was not magic, but a predictable, repeatable property of light passing through a transparent solid. The process to achieve this effect, however, was one of pure, painstaking empiricism. It required endless testing of angles, discovering which curves gathered light most effectively, and learning which minerals, like rock, crystal, or beryl, possessed the necessary clarity. Each successful lens was a testament to accumulated practical knowledge, a quiet triumph of observation and handcraft. Yet, the human experience of looking through that crystal and seeing a miniature, enlarged world was utterly mystical. How could a stone make the invisible visible? The only answer that felt sufficient was a story. So these clear crystals became frozen tears of gods, gifts from beings who saw all. They were seer stones believed to grant the power of far sight or reveal hidden truths. A carved crystal lens might be set into a priest's ring, used not to read fine script, but to symbolically peer into the human soul. The same physical object existed in two parallel realities. On the workbench of a craftsman, it was a tool, its value measured by its focal length and clarity. In the hand of a shaman, it was a sacred object, its value measured by its perceived connection to the divine. This was not a case of one belief replacing the other. Instead, they fueled each other. The profound symbolic power of the crystal as a revealer of truth provided a powerful cultural motivation to keep cutting, keep polishing, and keep improving the technology. The very act of perfecting the lens was, in a way, an act of devotion, an attempt to physically manifest the mythical power of clear vision. Every time a cutter successfully shaped a crystal that brought the tiny letters on a papyrus into focus, he was demonstrating a law of optics. And every time that same lens was used in a ritual to seek wisdom, it was validating a law of the spirit. In the focused beam of light passing through polished rock, the quest to see more clearly became a single journey, uniting the hand of the artisan with the vision of the mystic. A royal library was a fortress of knowledge, its walls lined with clay tablets and papyrus scrolls that held the entire known world. In the great collections of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh or within the temple precincts of Thebes, a scholar's daily work was a constant journey between two different realities. One scroll might contain the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describing how the god Marduk fashioned the heavens and earth from the body of the primordial goddess Tiamat. The very next tablet in the collection could be a starkly practical document, a map to copper mines in the mountains of Anatolia, detailing the specific rock layers where the richest ore could be found and the most efficient route for transport. Here, the symbolic birth of the world sat beside instructions for digging a hole in the ground. This was not an accident of filing, it was the entire point. These libraries were designed to contain the sum of all knowledge, sacred and secular, under one roof. A single priest or scribe would be responsible for both. He would consult a ritual text to learn the proper incantation for blessing a block of Lapis Lazuli, a hymn that described it as a fragment of the starry vault. Then he would turn to a merchant's ledger to verify its weight and assess its quality based on the depth of its blue color and the absence of white calcite streaks. His mind was forced to hold both truths at once. The stone was a piece of the cosmos, and it was also a tradable commodity with measurable properties. This daily, intimate contact with both frameworks created a new kind of intellectual friction. How could the mythic explanation for a mineral's origin remain entirely separate from the growing body of practical data about its actual source? A scholar copying a mining report would read that turquoise from the Sinai Peninsula was found in specific, narrow veins within sandstone. Then, while cataloging a religious poem, he would encounter a description of that same turquoise as the scattered scales of a celestial serpent. The contradiction was now institutionalized, written down in permanent ink and filed in the same room. This organizational proximity made the gap between myth and measurement impossible to ignore. It prompted the first systematic attempts at reconciliation. Perhaps a particularly thoughtful scribe, after years of this work, began to compose a new text. In it, he might suggest that the celestial serpent was not a literal beast, but a symbolic representation of the winding, subterranean veins described in the mining maps. He was not discarding the old story, but searching for a deeper layer of meaning that could accommodate both the spiritual significance and the physical evidence. The library, in its quiet, dusty halls, became the birthplace of a new form of thought, a bridge-building mentality that sought not to choose between the story and the fact, but to understand how they could both be true. This cosmopolitan trader was a walking library of the ancient world. He did not just carry goods in his pack, he carried entire cosmologies, translating not only languages but also the very ways cultures understood reality. Think of him arriving at a Mycenaean bronze smith's workshop. He would present his tin, a metal vital for making bronze stronger, to the smith, a practical man focused on his craft. The merchant would explain the material's behavior in the fire, its ideal melting point, and how it alloyed with copper to create a superior metal. His explanation was grounded in the observable, the empirical properties that any artisan could test and verify. Later, the same merchant might stand before Hittite priests in a temple. He offered the very same tin, but now his explanation transformed. He would speak of the metal's divine associations, perhaps linking it to a god of the earth or a celestial body, framing its properties within their sacred understanding of the world. The practical facts remained consistent, but the story wrapped around those facts changed to fit the audience. This was not deception. It was a sophisticated act of cultural mediation. The merchant had to be fluent in the language of the workshop and the tongue of the temple. His survival depended on his ability to make his goods intelligible and desirable within vastly different systems of meaning. In doing so, he became an unwitting agent of intellectual fusion. A practical smelting technique from the Levant, explained through the lens of local myth, might be adopted in Anatolia and then blended with that region's own sacred stories. A new way to test the purity of silver, shared between traders, would spread across empires, its practical utility overriding any differences in how they explained its origin. These traders were the living synapses connecting the brain of one civilization to another. With every transaction, they were not just moving minerals, they were quietly stitching together a patchwork of human knowledge, accelerating the moment when a purely local truth could become a universal understanding. A polished obsidian mirror did more than reflect a face, it revealed a cosmic truth. In the hands of a Mesoamerican priest, this dark, glassy surface was a portal to other realms, a tool for scrying and communicating with the spirit world. Its ritual use was deeply symbolic, tied to deities of the night and underworld. Yet, every time the priest gazed into its depths, he was also performing an unintentional experiment in optics. The consistent, predictable way the mirror reflected light, the clarity of the image it produced, and the specific angle of incidence equaling the angle of reflection were all physical laws being demonstrated over and over within a sacred context. The mirror was a spiritual instrument, but its very function depended on immutable principles of physics. A similar story unfolded with the exquisite jade by discs of ancient China. These large, perforated rings of nephrite were not mere decorations. They were ritual objects representing heaven, their circular form and central hole embodying the cosmic gateway between the earthly and celestial realms. Their primary value was deeply symbolic, but what happened when a ritual required such a disc to be spun? The smooth, consistent rotation, the way it would balance on a staff or continue spinning with minimal effort, demonstrated fundamental principles of rotational dynamics, of inertia and momentum. The priest spinning the bi-disc to honor the heavens was, without knowing it, exploring the same physical laws that a physicist would study millennia later. These objects existed in a unique conceptual space where their spiritual power and their material behavior were inseparable. The very act of using them for ceremony demanded physical manipulation, and that manipulation consistently revealed the hidden rules of the natural world. The obsidian mirror had to be polished to a perfect flatness to serve as a clear portal, a process that inherently taught lessons about light and reflection. The jade disc had to be carved with perfect symmetry to properly represent the cosmos, a requirement that led to an intuitive grasp of balance and motion. This overlap was not a coincidence, it was a fertile ground for discovery. The relentless pursuit of ritual perfection forced artisans and priests to become meticulous observers of material properties. They were not trying to prove a scientific hypothesis, they were trying to create a more powerful connection to the divine, but in doing so, they were compiling a vast, unspoken database of cause and effect, of action and reaction. The spiritual quest for meaning became, inadvertently, the most practical training ground for understanding the physical universe. Deep underground, in the flickering torchlight of a Sinai turquoise mine, you could hear a chorus of languages echoing off the rock walls. This was not just a place of extraction, but a living classroom. A miner from Canaan, his hands stained green from the ore, might show an Egyptian colleague how to spot the subtle color shift that indicated the richest vein. In return, the Egyptian might share a technique for propping up a precarious tunnel ceiling using shaped wooden beams. This was the daily trade in practical, life-saving knowledge, passed from one experienced hand to another. But the conversation never stopped there. After demonstrating his method, the Canaanite miner might then touch a small amulet at his neck, explaining that the technique was a gift from the god Baal, learned in a dream. His Egyptian partner, in turn, might anoint the new tunnel with a few drops of water, a small ritual to honor the earth god Geb, so he would not grow angry and collapse the passage. In this environment, a practical tip and its accompanying sacred story were a complete package. You did not just learn what to do, you learned why it worked within the grand order of the cosmos. The mine itself was seen as a living entity, a body that could either yield its treasures or become a tomb. Success required more than just strength and skill, it demanded respect. This belief was not a separate activity from the work. It was woven into its very fabric. The same miner who carefully assessed the rock's fracture lines would also know the precise prayer to recite before striking it. The ventilation shaft was both an engineering solution to a deadly problem and a spiritual conduit, allowing not just air to circulate but also malevolent spirits to escape. In the constant, palpable danger of the deep earth, no one was willing to rely on technique alone. The rituals provided a psychological framework for managing fear and uncertainty, while the shared practical knowledge offered tangible results. This constant, necessary interplay forged a new, hybrid understanding. A single piece of turquoise, once pulled from the rock, carried the weight of both its geological history and the layered myths from every culture that had labored to free it. The mine camp, with its shared peril and shared purpose, became one of history's most powerful melting pots, proving that the path to a deeper truth is often dug with both a pickaxe and a prayer. That heavy silver shekel in your hand was no longer just an offering. It was a price. This was the great transformation, the moment when the sacred materials of myth were forged into the cold, hard reality of currency. In the kingdom of Lydia, around the 7th century before the Common Era, a revolutionary object appeared, a lump of electrum stamped with a lion's head. Electrum was a natural alloy of gold and silver, but its composition was unpredictable. A merchant never knew if the coin in his hand was rich with gold or mostly silver, making its true value a constant gamble. The practical demands of trade forced a solution. The Lydian mint masters had to develop the first precise metallurgical standards, learning to refine and mix the metals to create coins of consistent, reliable value. They were not just minting currency, they were engineering trust. Yet, look at that coin. The lion, a symbol of royal power and the sun god, still roared from its surface. The sacred image now guaranteed the worldly value. A similar story unfolded half a world away in China with the emergence of bronze knife money. These were not mere tools, but stylized, ritual blades cast in a standardized size and weight. Their form recalled a sacred and practical object, a weapon, but their function was purely economic. To produce them required an astonishing mastery of bronze alloying and large-scale casting, a triumph of metallurgical science. But the knife shape itself was a powerful symbol, a ghost of its former self, now pressed into service as a unit of account. This fusion forced everyone, from a farmer selling grain to a merchant buying cloth, to live in two worlds at once. You had to think quantitatively, calculating if the weight of the silver was fair for the weight of the wheat. But you also thought qualitatively, recognizing the authority of the stamp, the cultural power of the symbol. The coin was a tiny, tangible crossroads. Its value was a number, a precise measure of weight and purity, but its meaning was a story, woven from the threads of myth and royal authority. Every time a person made a purchase, they were performing a quiet act of intellectual balance, weighing the concrete facts of commerce against the abstract power of symbolism. The marketplace had become a school, and its lesson was that even the most practical aspects of life were still haunted by the ghosts of sacred stories. These grand structures were a conversation in stone. When a Mesopotamian architect planned a ziggurat, his calculations were twofold. He specified millions of uniform-fired bricks for the core, a practical choice for stability in the sun-baked plains. But for the temple at its summit, he demanded Lapis Lazuli inlays and carnelian beads to adorn the statues of the gods. The blue stone connected the high temple to the heavens, while the red carnelian pulsed with the vitality of life itself. Every choice was a balance between the engineer's need for durability and the priest's demand for divine resonance. This synthesis was not a compromise, but a higher form of intelligence. The architect had to be fluent in the language of load-bearing walls and the poetry of sacred color. Walk through an Egyptian temple, and you are walking through a geological theology. The outer courts were often built of sturdy limestone, a practical and readily available material that could withstand the elements. But as you moved inward toward the Holy of Holies, the stone transformed. The walls might become rose granite from Aswan, a stone so hard it symbolized eternity and the indestructible power of the pharaoh. Deeper still, the innermost sanctuary might be fashioned from translucent alabaster, thin enough for the sun's rays to filter through, creating an ethereal glow around the cult statue. This was not random. It was a deliberate spatial progression from the mundane to the divine, mapped onto a journey from one type of stone to another. The builder had to know that alabaster was soft enough to carve into delicate windows, yet strong enough to support a roof. He also had to understand that its luminous quality made it the perfect flesh for a god. The entire building process became a ritual. The quarrying of each stone block was accompanied by prayers. The laying of the foundation deposit involved placing sacred minerals in the trenches. The very act of construction was an act of worship, and the principles of physics were the unwritten liturgy. People did not just visit these spaces, they lived within this dialogue. To touch a wall of cool granite, it was to feel both the enduring strength of the mountain and the eternal presence of a deity. The architecture itself taught the lesson that the world was built on a foundation where the practical and the sacred were one and the same. A jade diviner casts polished stones onto a patterned cloth, searching for messages from the ancestors. This practice, lithomancy, was the world's first attempt to model chaos, to find a signal in the noise. At its heart was a profound belief that the universe spoke through symbols, that the random fall of stones could reveal the will of the gods. Yet, in the quiet repetition of this ritual, something else began to happen. A diviner might cast the stones at the first sign of the autumn rains year after year. Over generations, a sharp-eyed practitioner could begin to notice a subtle correlation. Perhaps a specific scattering of dark, river-worn pebbles seemed to appear more often just before an unusually harsh winter. What began as a symbolic message from a deity could slowly transform into an empirical warning of a coming storm. The pattern did not lose its sacred meaning, but it gained a practical, predictable weight. This was the delicate pivot from divination to prediction. The same mind that sought meaning in randomness was training itself to recognize recurring sequences, to connect an effect in the stones with a cause in the world. In Shang Dynasty China, this fusion was carved into history. Oracle bones, often made of jade or other sacred stones, were used in pyromancy. A question for the ancestors was inscribed, heat was applied, and the resulting cracks were interpreted. The cracks were divine messages, a form of lithomancy written in fire. But the inscriptions on these very bones did not stop at recording the questions and the diviner's interpretations. They also meticulously documented real-world outcomes. They noted celestial events like eclipses and the appearance of comets, and they recorded the success or failure of royal hunts and military campaigns. Over time, this created a vast archive. A priest could look back and see that a particular branching crack pattern, once thought to signify the pleasure of a rain god, had been followed by a successful harvest 3 years in a row. The symbolic was being cross-referenced with the historical. The ritual was generating data. This was the crucial transition, the moment the gateway opened. The human desire to understand divine will, expressed through the medium of stone, accidentally created a system for tracking the consistent patterns of nature itself. The stones were no longer just messengers from the gods. They were becoming keys to a locked door, behind which lay the predictable, rhythmic laws of the physical world. The world was built from a body. Before any miner could understand why a vein of copper ran through a mountain, a story explained it as the rib of a slain goddess. The great Babylonian epic Enuma Elish did not just describe a battle between gods, it described the first geological survey. From the flesh of the primordial goddess Tiamat, the god Marduk fashioned the earth. Her eyes became the sources of the great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. Her skull was lifted to form the dome of the sky, and within her remains, the very minerals that traders sought were given a divine origin and a logical place. This was not a random collection of tales. It was a complete, systematic theory of why things were where they were. If salt deposits were found in a particular region, a myth might explain them as the dried sweat of a giant who fell there. A source of gleaming obsidian could be the shattered teeth of a subterranean monster. Every mineral had a story, and every story gave it a location on a cosmic map. This mythological framework was the earliest form of geology. It answered the most fundamental questions. Where did this stone come from? Why is it here and not there? The answers were woven from divine drama, but the intent was profoundly rational, to create a coherent model of the world's structure. When a merchant traveled from one land to another, he did not just carry these stories in his memory. He carried this entire way of thinking, this deeply ingrained habit of seeking a unified explanation for the distribution of the earth's treasures. The story of Tiamat's body was far more than a creation myth. It was a prototype. It established in the human mind the powerful idea that the landscape was not a random assortment of rocks, but a system that could be understood, a puzzle that could be solved. This cognitive pattern, this relentless drive to find the underlying logic of the physical world, would one day be applied with hammers and maps instead of gods and monsters. But the quest itself, the need to ask why the mountains hold metal and the rivers carry gold, began with a story about a goddess whose body became the world we walk